Welcome to all of you tuning in for Spirituality Thursday. I'm so glad to be able to talk with you again through the medium of the internet, and I hope you are well. And today's discussion topic will be about creation stories and creation myths. And we're really going to look at a few different narratives, and the goal is to help us see these creation stories, hopefully with new eyes, with a new joy of looking at them, or at the very least with a renewed interest in these, because they are very fascinating. And so to help us, experience this with new eyes, I've brought together a few different creation narratives today. A few are from the Bible, not counting Genesis, a few that you might not be as familiar with or didn't exactly recognize they were creation narratives. A couple from other faiths and cultures, and one will be from a fictional novel. And so that one's a lot of fun. That's going to kind of bring it to a close at the end. So let us go ahead and begin. Here we have the Gospel of John. So at the very beginning of the Gospel of John, no one really thinks about it, but that is a creation narrative. And so here it is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So, building on this from Genesis, John is inspired to write this gospel, and he is equating Jesus as part of the Trinity. And so the Gospel of John, everyone knows this one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's just a beautiful way of summarizing it. Another thing that people don't really think about in Scripture is Psalm 104. Sometimes this is called, among particular circles, the creation psalm, but it's really long, so what I'm going to do is just skim it real quick and get a few verses. The Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent and lays the beams of his upper chambers on the waters. He makes springs pour water into the ravines. It flows between the mountains. He waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The land is satisfied by the fruit of his work. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens human hearts, oil to make their faces shine, and bread that sustains their hearts. I think this is a really nice one because people don't oftentimes think about the connection between creation and sustaining. For ancient peoples who are more agrarian and more tied to the earth, the concept of your survival and creation being directly linked, and if that link was broken, then you didn't have food for that winter. And so, once again, the Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent and lays the beams of his upper chambers. So this one starts with a very short beginning of creation, and this is sort of the map of creation. It's very simplistic and poetic at the same time. And then immediately it jumps into on the earth. So this is what God did, and it's all in one sentence, and this is how creation sustains us. Wine to gladden human hearts, and oil to make our faces shine, and bread that sustains our hearts. So not only that there's creation, but there is this continuing work of creation. The next creation narrative is a journey into a different religion. It's from the Upanishads, which is an Eastern and Indian text. It's Hindu. Lost my page. Here it is. From the Upanishads. In the beginning, there was only the Great Self, reflected in the form of a person. Reflecting, it found nothing but itself, and its first word was, "This am I." I'll read that one again because it has a different kind of language and feel to it, and it's short. In the beginning, there was only the great self, reflected in the form of a person. Reflecting, it found nothing but itself, and its first word was, "This am I." That's from the Upanishads. And if you ever worked around children, especially as they're like learning the first words and the first languages, or anybody who's been a teacher can relate to that experience where you're teaching a kid in the classroom, and the light bulb lights up, and they get the idea, and you can see it in their eyes that they understand. This every time I hear this one, it always brings that to my mind. This am I. It's that aha moment. Like, I get it. This is what it is. And we all have had that point at some point in our lives. Of course, we don't remember it, but there's been a point for all of us where we say, this is who I am. I am me, and this is what I think. And it happened when we were very young, and we probably can't really pinpoint that exact moment, but it did happen at some point. The next creation narrative that I want to share with you is from the Pima Indians. In the beginning, there was only darkness everywhere, darkness and water, and the darkness gathered thick in places, crowding together and then separating, crowding and separating. I like this one because it sounds very much like Genesis to me, and I think you could actually be forgiven for reading that very quickly and thinking, oh, that must be like, somewhere in Genesis chapter 2 or something. That must be there. In the beginning, there was only darkness everywhere, darkness and water. And the darkness gathered thick in places, crowding together and then separating, crowding and separating. So very much kind of akin to the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. So there are a lot of creation stories in the world, and all of them, as far as I am aware, deal with some aspect of creation, either from a person's perspective or from God's perspective, or from a disembodied narrative perspective, such as the one we began with John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. So it's either a human perspective, God's perspective, or like a disembodied narrative voice. Obviously, Genesis, which we'll read here in a second, that would be Moses' voice as the author of Genesis. And the one from the Upanishads, you can sort of imagine that being a very human voice. In the beginning, there was only the great self reflected in the form of a person. So you can sort of imagine the process of coming into being and to being aware of who you are. And its first word was, "This am I." And sort of like the first thought is this excited, hey, I'm here kind of a thing. So creation is good. And I think it's fun to talk about these things because, like skipping a little bit ahead of myself, the last narrative I want to read, I apologize. The last narrative is, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And that reading is from Genesis, that sentence. So creation itself is good, and I think that's why it's good to create, why it's fun to create. All of us, regardless of our artistic abilities, we are all artists in some way. We all, pick our clothing out that we particularly like. Like, obviously, I like this blue shirt. I've worn it a couple of times for these videos, when I arrange this background, it's not the best in the world, but it says something about my artistic sensibilities. Don't judge me too much for my decorations here. But all of us sort of, we put ourselves in the image of the Creator on a daily basis, trying to make the world more perfect, more beautiful, more orderly, even if it's just organizing like a big stack of papers, right? And you have your desk or something all spread out, and so you're putting everything together. We constantly are sort of called to this sense of creation in innumerable and various ways. And creation is fun in that way. It's sort of like the concept of being human is to create, to be able to work with your hands. And I'm sure we've all sort of, had the imaginative process of coming up with creative ways to pass the day, or when we're reading, say, like, the Gospels, where we're reading ourselves into them using our imagination, or parables or other stories. Personally, one of my favorite things to use my imagination for, I like to, especially when I read the Gospels, sort of imagine things, sort of like close my eyes and imagine, sitting next to Jesus by a campfire, and I can actually feel the warmth of the fire. And maybe all of this just took place after the feeding of the 5,000. So, that miracle happened, and everyone's like, wow, what's going on? And sort of that quiet, you can maybe hear animals rustling in the distance as the sun goes down. You can use your imagination for things like that, that creative spark within us. Or you can sort of imagine, as you look over the water, if you're ever out somewhere, looking over a pond or a creek, or even like a fountain in the garden, like if you're looking out the water, and sort of as you hear that sound, you just imagine Moses sitting on the edge of the Mediterranean as he's trying to figure out how to put into words and to encapsulate the vision of Genesis that he has had. How does he explain this? And so as he's looking out over the water, and he's like, how do I explain this gift that has been given to me by God? How do I convey this? And he looks out over the water as there's the early morning fog, as it were, and he says, the Spirit of God hovered across the water. We all have our creative imagination, and when we can find a way to use that creativity and to put it into the story that we are reading, I find that works really well as a dialogue. That's our way of communicating with the text. Once I participated in a prayer group, and one of the members suggested that the Bible is a living text. Every time you read it, you're stepping into a new text. It has never spoken to you before. This is a completely new experience, and it will say something new to you again. And certainly, a little bit simpler way to say that would be, from the Eastern metaphor of you can never step in the same river twice because the water is constantly flowing. Likewise, every time you read a text, you are not the same person, and so the text, using that creative spark within you, speaks to you on a different level. So regardless of how you use your imagination in that way, the dialogue with the text always makes it beneficial in some way. The final creation narrative I want to talk about is a little more fun. It doesn't have the somberness of the other creation narratives, because this one is from a fictional story. It's actually intended to be a work of fiction, not a religious text. So this is from, this is called The Parable of the Badger, and it's from The Sword and the Stone, written by White. And in White's version of The Sword and the Stone, young Arthur, before he's King Arthur, young Arthur and Merlin are talking, and it's time for his final lesson. And so Merlin magically, poof, makes Arthur a badger. And he sends him out to find this famous scholarly badger. Apparently badgers are scholars. And find this famous scholarly badger who is supposed to teach Arthur his final lesson. It's in the dead of winter. Snow is everywhere. It's quite cold. And when the boy arrives, the badger, the scholar badger, has just finished writing his doctoral thesis. And he's doctoral dissertation, and he's quite proud of his accomplishment. And the topic of his dissertation: why do humans have the order of dominion over all of Earth's creatures? Why are humans the ones who are in charge of everything? And according to the badger, this is basically the synopsis of his dissertation. God summoned all of the embryos of the world together at the dawn of creation. And before him, he offered all of these embryos the opportunity. Before he finished creating them, they could alter any of their features, anything they wanted. All of the embryos asked for changes in their hands, their teeth or their hides to better survive in the world. Some asked for feathers and wings. Some asked for cold-blooded nature so their metabolism would be lower and they could sleep for longer periods of time. Some of them asked for really thick hides. Some asked for sharp teeth. All of these embryos asked for different things until finally God's granting all of these wishes in an assembly line. They're all coming directly at God. And this one says, I want to be a dog. And God's like, poof, you're now a dog. The next embryo comes up. I want to be a cat. Poof, you're a cat. Third embryo comes up, says, I want to be a shark. Poof, you're a shark. Fourth, you're a platypus. Whatever animal, whatever creature that they asked for, God, granted that. The very last embryo comes up. And God asks this embryo, what is it you want? And this embryo, the last embryo, decided that it would be offensive to God, who's done all of this work and has made this embryo who he is or she is. It would be very rude to imply there was some kind of flaw in the design. So the embryo very shyly says, well, I don't think I need anything. I think, God, if it's okay with you, I'll be as you made me to be. And God is immensely delighted. And God proclaimed that this embryo, which is humankind, is the only one who has guessed our riddle. And God called all of the embryos back together who had now become ducks and chickens and cows and horses and sharks and all of those animals, whatever animal you can think of. Lions and tigers and bears, God calls them all back together and says that this one embryo, this is the one that got it. This is the one that guessed the riddle. This embryo was created in the image of God, in our image. So according to this, according to the badger, God then placed the order of dominion upon all of humankind. Because that branch of embryos were the only ones not to ask for changes, they are now knighted, as it were, by God. They were appointed as the guardians of the earth. The order of dominion is granted to them. And so this is why, according to the badger, two things come out of this. Number one, why is it all embryos look the same? And the badger, in this very fun story, says the reason all embryos look the same is because that is the image of God. Number two, why are humans the only ones who seem to be in charge of everything here on this world? And that is because the humans did not ask for anything more than to be made in the image of God. I think it's especially ironic because now it's almost like as advanced as we've become, as intellectual and all of these things, it's almost like it's kind of swapped now that animals are becoming more closely akin to God because we have fallen so far away. And of course, all of this is before the Garden of Eden narrative with the snake and all of those things too. So this is the very, very beginning according to the badger. And in summary, that is the parable of the badger. So we've looked at a few different creation stories today. The Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We looked at the creation psalm, Psalm 140. The Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent and lays the beams of his upper chambers upon the waters. That's Psalm 104. The Upanishads, this am I. The Pima Indians, in the beginning there was only darkness everywhere, darkness and water. And we looked at a very brief reading from Genesis, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And of course, the last one, the parable of the badger, where all of the embryos step forth for asking for changes to their physical nature, except for one who very shyly says, I'm okay with what you have given me, God. So these are the creation stories. So with that, I'd like to end with reading Genesis. And when I read this, let's sort of imagine, as all of these animals are created, sort of just imagine them picking what they want. It's not just God made a dog, according to the badger in this fun imagining. God made this creature and said, what would you like? And the badger says, the badger describes what he would like, and the dog would describe what he would like, or she. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form or shape, with darkness over the abyss and a mighty wind sweeping over the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. God then separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Evening came, and morning followed, the first day. Then God said, let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, tame animals, crawling things, and every kind of wild animal. And so it happened. God made each kind of wild animal, every kind of tame animal, and every kind of thing that crawls upon the ground. God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, and all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Well, thank you for joining us today for this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and I hope you've got a lot out of hearing these various creation stories and through this humorous lens of the parable of the badger, which is a very nice story, helping us delve a little deeper into Genesis as well. I hope you have a great Thursday, and I look forward to joining you again next Thursday for our spirituality discussion. Thank you.